Here we go again. The material that we've gone through so far has been Joshua and Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel. So we are now at the point of going into 1st and 2nd Kings. It's the 7th of our times. This is on, correct? Okay. This is the first Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings is what forms what we call the former prophets. All right, these are the ones where we're going to have names of prophets like Gad and Nathan and Samuel and Elijah and Elisha, but they are not known primarily for their writings. So, except for maybe a random little poem or song somewhere here or there, we don't have much about what their proclamation is, unlike what we're going to see all next year when we see Amos and Hosea and Micah and Isaiah from the 8th century prophets, and then all the rest of them, Ezekiel and Jeremiah and all the others from the 7th and 6th and even 5th century prophets, where primarily what we are going to have is their proclamation to the people of Israel from God. And so this second major part of the scriptures, remember the first part is the Torah, and the second part is the Nevi'im, which is Navi, is the classic word for a prophet. And so these are divided up in our English Bibles into former and latter prophets, and we are going in the exact order at this point through what we're doing the end of this unit. We're going by the order as it is in the Hebrew Bible. So you're going to find in your Bible something like we missed Ruth and we missed Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. Some of those we're going to miss before we go into the prophets. We'll pick those up in what's called the material on the writings. So our first year is the Torah and former prophets. The second year is the latter prophets. The third year is the writings. The fourth year is the Gospels and Paul. And the fifth year will be the rest of the New Testament and church history. All right, so that's how we're going to lay that out. And I may have two of you in front of me by the time this is all done. I hope you can maybe recruit somebody along the way, but that's the way that is. And so here's where we are. We're down toward this section here. The major story today, of course, is going to be Solomon. We're going to have some of the kings of Israel and Judah next time, but most of the story will be about Elijah. The week after that, a large part of the story will be about Elisha, not all of it, but a good amount, and then the fall of the northern kingdom and the fall of the southern kingdom. So primarily, what we will have in the writing prophets from Amos and Hosea on is going to be what we're going to see in 1st and 2nd, or in 2nd Kings. Okay, so it will be as the northern kingdom comes to an end, as the southern kingdom comes to an end, and as there is hope for the future. So here we are with 1st Kings. First of all, we're going to see about Adonijah and Solomon, and then about the divided kingdom. And then as we go on, we're going to see about Omri and Ahab in the north, and Baal worship and Elijah. That's all going to be either this week or next week. So now I have to get through those more brief summaries, and we get here to
Excuse me.
Hello.
What year was, now for Kings, you had 960 to what?
Don't worry about it.
Oh.
Don't worry about it. You'll have sheets where you'll have it all. Okay? The easiest thing, it's very rough, but the easiest thing to try to remember is Abraham is about 1900 before Christ. So about as far before as we are after Christ. Moses is about 1300 before Christ when we find the deliverance. Okay, somewhere in there during the time of Ramses. David is about 1000 before Christ. Okay, so 40 years, and Solomon is 960 to 922, or 961 to 922, and then we go on from there. The northern kingdom will come to an end in 722, and the southern kingdom in 586. And I'll give you those dates a lot, and you will remember them about as long as they reverberate in the air, and then the next time I will say them again, and the next time I will say them again. It's hard to keep it in mind when, it's not our bailiwick, but anyway, if you can think of 1900, 1300, and 1000. That's good enough for right now. So David, as David dies, is about 960. Now, the norm of the way in which these books have been divided has usually been that they're divided when someone dies. So Joshua ends with Joshua's death. Okay, and 1 Samuel is not too much farther after Samuel's death, but it'll be the death of Saul. But here we have 2 chapters in 1 Kings that are still talking about David. And so all of this has to be speculation, but the question would be, why would 1 Kings start before David dies? What's the major event? And if you look back into the last chapter of 2 Samuel, the major event is the purchase, the acquisition of the land on which the temple will be built. Right? And so because worship is so central, particularly as they're going to come back from the exile after the end of 2 Kings, then when they come back 50 years or so later, they will rebuild the temple, but not the palace. And so it would seem that as they're looking for a break, and what's the rough amount of time, that at least one major theory is buying the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, where the plague ended, where the angel of death quit destroying the people after the census that was taken by David, that it is because of that that is seen as a major event. Anyway, you can do with it what you will, but when I originally put this together, I stayed with the books. When I taught it at Concordia, then I would take 1 Kings 1 and 2 as part of the David unit and cover the whole David story. So in the early years when I was at Concordia, it was the years of a lot of different premiers in the USSR. One after another, they get these old geezers in there who maybe can make it for about 6 months or something, and then they say they are on vacation at their dacha, when actually they are taking their last 3 breaths. And so anytime a country has a leader who is ill, they have to act as if nothing is wrong. And so I remember when King Hussein of Jordan died, they were still talking about him as being strong and having a good report, even when they were flying him out of Rochester so he could die in his own country. And so here's David. And he is so old, he's almost 70. He is so old that he is shivering every night. Okay, so he needs a bed warmer. The power was out. Sears didn't have any more of the mattress pads, and so they got Abishag the Shunammite in instead. Huh? No flannel sheets, no. The strange thing about it is, well, maybe not strange, it says he did not have sex with her. She was simply keeping him warm. But everybody on the outside is going to say, he just got a new girl. He must be really still strong and still going at it. In those early years, I would be able to at least have some people in class remember George Burns. And after Gracie died, George still had all these girls around him, so he'd always be spoken as Stogie, and have a whole bunch of girls around him advertising something. He actually lived to be over 100, and I don't think he ever did it, but he got booked on his 100th birthday for Las Vegas. I don't think he was able to make it.
I don't think he was.
And he died a few months after that. But, saying, I'm strong, I'm virile, so you're giving the impression to everybody out there that everything is going well, when internally you know that the king is getting pretty decrepit and isn't going to be making it much longer. So they get Abishag the Shunammite. We're going to see her again in a minute. And which kings or which sons have we already seen take their bad turn? Amnon, first of all, who rapes his half-sister, Tamar. Absalom will kill him. And then right after that, we have Absalom getting killed, and he is put to death then as another pretender. His father doesn't even want him to be put to death, but he is killed anyway. And that's toward the end, not right at the end of what we have in 2 Samuel. But, and then there is a third one, Adonijah. And then a fourth one, whose name is either Kileab or Daniel, depending whether you're in Kings or Chronicles. And there are all sorts of little questions along the way when you really start listing everything out. Sometimes you'll just have a parenthesis with another name given. They say, well, it had more than one name. Moses' father-in-law is like this, as well as Reuel or Jethro or Hobab. And so here anyway, Adonijah, big, tall, strapping guy, never got in any trouble with his father. He gets his 50 men to run before his chariot and starts, planning for himself to be the next king. And we have a little bit of trouble along the way because Bathsheba had been told by David, your son Solomon is going to succeed me. Right? Now, Adonijah says, I'm going to be the next king, but not everybody is on his side. So first of all, Joab, who is the general, you remember Joab, he's the one who killed Absalom, he's the one who kills Amasa, he's the one who had killed Abner, so we got all sorts of trouble with him. Abiathar, who is one of the high priests, the great-great-grandson of Eli, also sides with Adonijah. And on the other side, we have Zadok, the other high priest, who kind of just appears all of a sudden, Nathan the prophet, and Bathsheba saying, hey, wait a minute, Solomon is supposed to become the king, and they're anointing Adonijah down at the southern end of the city. Think of yourself as a catcher in baseball, standing behind the plate. To the right is the Kidron Valley that comes around, and it goes way down deep into the valley. On the other side is the Hinnom Valley. In the New Testament, it's what we'll talk about as Hinnom or Gehenna, where they used to burn a lot of their trash. And so that's coming down the other way. There is a cheesemaker's valley, the Tyropian Valley, in the middle, kind of not quite centered, but a little bit more to the right. That very southeastern part was the city of David. Today, the whole plate, roughly, except for the bottom point of it, it's not an exact square, but the city of David, the walls of Jerusalem today, do not surround exactly what was once upon a time the kingdom of David, okay, or the city of David. David basically had only what was east of the Cheesemaker's Valley. And what's west of it will be enclosed a couple of centuries after this yet, with a threat from the Assyrians. So, at the very bottom point is where Adonijah goes. And he goes to a pool. And so they're anointed by water. Okay, even though they're being anointed with oil, they're anointed by water. And so Abiathar and Joab and Adonijah and all of the others that he can get together, they're going and getting anointed. You know there's something wrong with this because Daddy isn't there. Right now, he didn't tell his dad what he was going to do. Now David is apparently in a situation where he's laid up, whether he's in bed all the time or what, we don't know. But as the noise is going on about all of this, Bathsheba first goes in and bows down before the king and lays out her case. Nathan then comes in right after that, and David says, yes, Solomon is the one that I decide would become king. The very southeastern hill is what was originally Zion, and not a very long distance at all. My guess would be it was maybe at most 4 football fields, 2 and 2, just and maybe not even that much. When you're building a city, basically you're building a fortress, somewhere where you can keep your loot inside, and so it's not real wide and it's not real long. right? And at the present time, today, it is outside the city walls. Down below it is what's called the Gihon Spring. Guach or Giach in Hebrew is the word for water gushing up from the ground. It's actually the name also of one of the 4 rivers back in Genesis chapter 2. And so they hustle Solomon down on the king's mule, just right down the hill. It's maybe 60 feet up to down. They go back and forth on their path. So right below there, they hustle and they anoint him as king there, and then blow the trumpets and say, Solomon is king. We've already heard that Adonijah is king. And so then Adonijah says, it's supposed to be mine. I'm the oldest remaining son. I've never done anything wrong against my father, but I guess I better acknowledge Solomon is king. Now, what might be going on here, and there's always a lot of guesswork in any kind of Bible study we're doing, what might be going on is that Solomon was born in Jerusalem, and that he might thus be considered, okay, he's a real Jerusalemite, not just somebody from down in Judah, and thus he will rule really over 3 kingdoms, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and Jerusalem. That's a guess, and it's just kind of a standard way that some people would look at that. So at first Adonijah acquiesces and says, okay, but everybody's got to try and make a little trouble for themselves, and he is going to as well. Chapter 2. David is close to death, and he charges his son Solomon with the duties of kingship. We've said quite often in the material from Samuel that one of the problems that we have with David is he is too tender to his own family. Technically, he should have put his first son Amnon to death. Right? Technically, he should have said, go destroy Absalom, kill him, get rid of him, instead of spare him, so that he can come and try and do it again. Okay, so there's all sorts of different kinds of things that are going on here. Joab is still alive. He should have put him to death when he killed Abner, one of his nephews, and because of the youngest one being killed. So, David says to Solomon, there's a few things to clean up so that we get rid of whatever blood guilt is still kicking around. So let's take care of those last items. And there are several of them. First of all, he says, deal with Joab. Now there is a phrase, and I don't have internet down here, but on the otherwise I'd look it up on the web and just show you a picture of it. I don't have a picture otherwise, but they used to have horns on the altar. And what this means is you'd have a kind of a square altar, and you'd put an animal on top of that you were going to prepare for sacrifice or have sacrificed. And those horns, they're just kind of projections of stone on each corner that keeps the animal from sliding off. And so there was a technical thing that you could go and hold onto the horns of the altar as you are claiming that you have a right not to be killed. Right, and you would at least get your day in court. But Joab is going to go and he is going to seize the horns of the altar, and Solomon's going to say, I don't care, kill him. If he wants to be killed right in the temple, kill him. And so they put him to death. Oddly enough, for the deaths of Abner and Amasa, the two generals, the one the general for Saul, the other the general for Absalom. It doesn't say that he's getting killed for killing Absalom. Okay, it's those other two leaders, even though Absalom is acting as if he is the king as well. Then there's Barzillai the Gileadite. And Barzillai is the one in Mahanaim who took care of David when he fled. He provided him food. Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, had given him food on the way, but then Barzillai gives him food while he is dealing with Absalom. And Barzillai is the one who said, I'm too old, I'm going back home, but if you want to take care of any of my family members, so Chimhan, C-H-I-M-H-A-N, I think is how spelled. Chimham is dealt with, and so he gets some benefit, and he has some arrangement. Then Shimei. Anybody remember Shimei? This is the Benjaminite who was walking along above the road where David is fleeing, who is from Benjamin, who's cursing David and saying, all of this is happening to you because you killed Saul, your king, whom you were serving. You got him killed. And so even though David was innocent, at least technically innocent of all those things, one thing for sure, one thing I didn't mention it before, but one thing for sure, what could David have done when Achish, the king of Gath, said, you go back home? He could have circled around, joined forces with Saul against the Philistines. Instead, he just went back home to Ziklag. He was up there, he was right at the battle scene. He could have gone over to Saul, even though Saul was trying to kill him, and say, hey, I'm here to help you. I'm not here to kill you. Let me help you in battle. That's never speculated about anywhere, but that would have been another possibility. Instead, he goes back down to Ziklag, finds out that everybody has been stolen away, and then gets his family members back. So, there are some other opportunities that we could have. Shimei, when David came back, was the first guy to meet him at the river. And he says, David, I have sinned. Just plain flat out says, I have sinned against you. And of course, Joab and Abishai say, hey, we got to put that guy to death. We should have before. And David says, today is a day of victory. I'm going back home. Nobody dies today. But, as this goes on then, those three have to be dealt with, along with Adonijah. So the first thing, Adonijah goes to Bathsheba and says, can I have this little teeny tiny favor? Can I have Abishag the Shunammite? Now, if you remember, any time there are concubines or wives, they belong to the new king.
After the other one's dead.
Huh? After the other one is dead.
Yeah.
And David is dead now. And so Adonijah says, I would just like Abishag. We're not told why, but the technical thing would be, I deserve to get some of the benefits of my father. And so Bathsheba goes into Solomon, and again, we don't know, does she know exactly how he's going to respond or not? It just doesn't say. But Bathsheba goes in and says, can I ask you this one teeny, teeny, weeny, teeny favor? Can Adonijah have Abishag? He says, Mom, I'll give you whatever you want. And then can Adonijah have Abishag? And he says, off with his head. Now, next he wants the whole kingdom. That's exactly what happened with Abner when he asked for Rizpah from Ishbaal, Saul's son. Except he didn't get killed. Later, Ishbaal gets killed. But again, I want the concubine. It's what happened with Reuben after Rachel died, but not, Jacob was still alive at that point. And so we see this again and again. I guess they didn't go to Sunday school or Saturday school, I guess they just didn't study their Bible well enough. Because these ideas are going around. I mean, people understand what you are to do or not to do, and yet these keep on happening. So Adonijah dies. Yes, Bruce?
In the Bible, and this Old Testament, there's a lot of stuff that you never hear what the rest of the story is. But the important thing is, that isn't important, is it? Is that what's being said?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can never tell a story completely.
Exactly. And the whole thing is based upon faith.
Well,
Is that?
that's a word that's not going to be used around here. Not in this material. Okay. This material isn't going to use the word faith.
Oh.
This is going to simply say, how did the people act on the basis of God's promises? How did they respond within that? And there's going to be a hole in every sieve. So but the main thing is that Solomon is going to deal with the wickedness that his father didn't deal with on behalf of his father. So it's really David's desires that are being carried out. So David says, well, I'm not going to lop his head off today, but tomorrow wouldn't be a bad day. And the day after I die, make sure they die with me. It didn't happen, but at the time when Herod died, he wanted a whole bunch, I forget what the number is off the top of my head, but he wanted a whole bunch of the leaders of the Jews to be crucified the day he died. Because he said, I at least want somebody crying on the day I die. Because I know otherwise nobody's going to be crying. They were kind enough not to do that. But he wanted people crying the day he died. And he said, somebody will be crying because crucify a bunch of others. Well, when a king dies, you have to decide, are you still going to carry out his wishes? Solomon is. Not everybody, he didn't have to either. But all of those are threats to Solomon. If you let the contagion go, then it can bring further problems along the way. So that's what is there.
Yeah.
Clean up the wickedness that has to be dealt with. Clean up all of the problems that have to be addressed. But all of the reasons why, I mean, we never hear another word about Abishag the Shunammite. Was she one of the 700 wives or 300 concubines? We have no idea.
Yeah.
You have to assume so, but I mean, it is only to show that there are people who don't like what God wants, and sooner or later they get dealt with. So he's not going to allow people who are going to destroy his land or his promises. But that's going to include Solomon by the end of the game.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you.
and when you think of who are the big names in the Old Testament, among the men, you've got Adam and Abraham and Moses and David and Solomon, and every one of them. I mean, Saul and David and Solomon, every one of them start out as little teeny tiny wimpy people, you know. Oh, I'm not a very, I'm the lowest flea, I'm the lowest dog in my family. And then every one of them later, in their power, take over and decide they're going to run the show. And that is the threat, I think, that every Christian has to understand as well. We always remain servants of the Lord. It's not our church, it's his church. And
There
we
ain't no
don't get
change
to...
in the guard.
Pardon?
There's no change in the guard.
There's no
God.
changing the guard.
Yeah.
I will often mention here the pastor at Emmaus is Jesus. I get to be the assisting pastor here in this place. But it better be his will that's done and proclaimed, or else it's really not his church. And that's the hard thing, is to say, I am always under authority of someone else. Which is interesting, because that's the word nagid that's used for the prince. Both Saul and David are called princes. God, in some sense, is still the king. But each one of them in their own way, and Solomon's going to go way overboard, as we'll see today. Okay? So, yeah, we all want to know more of the story.
Yeah.
But instead of saying, let's make up the rest of it, let's try to say, what is there? And what's staring us in the face about what it wants to say. Okay? God appointed Solomon. Even Adonijah acknowledges that. I think I should become the king, but God anointed him. I'll step aside unwillingly. Jonathan was the one who said, I'll step aside willingly, because I see that David is going to become the next king. One of the very few that's going to say, I won't fight it. And John the Baptist the same way, he must increase and I must decrease. But that doesn't happen very often in the Bible.
You see mostly contestment with these people contesting things, don't they?
Yep, well,
Yeah,
nothing has changed.
yeah,
Nothing has changed.
yeah.
There are still different people in every church body who have different ideas about the way things ought to be run. And they might each say, I think I'm speaking for the Lord. And then finally, you have to say, okay, now, how are we going to resolve that somehow? And it's usually a pretty messy deal by the time all is said and done. And so here, Abiathar is the next guy. Now, Abiathar, he's sided with Adonijah. But he is the one, he's the great-grandson of Eli, who fled when his father and all the other family was killed by Doeg the Edomite on behalf of Saul. And so David says, he made a mistake here, but he has served me faithfully all the way through. So, he is banished to Anathoth, which is just a few miles north of Jerusalem. So he is banished. He is allowed to live. He is not put to death. But we had seen very early on in the Eli story that Eli's family was only going to survive to the 5th generation. And then they were not going to be high priests anymore. And so that's being fulfilled here. Okay. Now, the interesting thing, which I will look at with you next spring, if you should choose to survive on into next spring, is at the very beginning of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is going to be from among the priests in Anathoth. And the way the biblical story sounds, he is a descendant of Abiathar, both a prophet but also a priest. And he will talk in chapter 7 of Jeremiah about go to see what happened at Shiloh, which is where it would be his great-great-great-grandfather some generations back who would have been the high priest when Shiloh was burned down. And so, you know, when Shiloh was burned down and the family of Eli was all in disarray and the ark had been taken, we don't have much in Samuel about it, but there are a variety of other places that say the whole city was destroyed. And so Jeremiah is going to stand in the temple, and he is going to say, you think this temple is permanent? Why, I have a family story about Shiloh, where my relatives thought that was permanent, and it got destroyed. So don't think this one's going to stand. This one's going down too. And that's the one with that passage where you have made my house into a den of robbers. That's in the Jeremiah 7 material. And God says to Jeremiah there, don't you even bother me with praying for them. They're done. I'm removing them. Don't you even bother. And that'll be about 600 before Christ, roughly, very roughly. But Jeremiah it sort of leaves it pretty open. He's the one who's descended from Abiathar. Now, when I get there next spring, and I ask you, do you remember Anathoth? What will you say?
Yes.
A 2-letter word.
No.
And then I will tell you the story again.
Why not?
Okay, why not? Yeah, it's free, it's cheap, you know.
Quick question. According to the Bible, the kings and others had all kinds of concubines.
Mhm. Mostly the kings,
Yeah, okay.
and just the first few of them.
Is this similar to the harems that the
Yes.
Middle East had?
Yeah, yeah, and that simply means that if you are a king, you, I don't know how big the Saudi Arabian family, the Saud family is, but it's the same kind of thing. All the leaders are, or all the officials are family. And so they have lots of children. We're never told how many children Solomon, I don't think we're told how many children Solomon has. And the numbers here pretty much are told to let us know that he went after other gods. That's the big thing that we're going to hear at this point, is that he went after other gods to serve them. Yeah.
The concubines, that was not by choice necessarily, but.
Not for the women.
No, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
But now, I think I've read in other places that in the Middle East now, sometimes they're asked to become a member of the harem.
That could be.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for it also in the Solomon story is that a lot of these women probably were given by their father when there was a peace treaty made.
Okay.
And that's not necessarily for their father's benefit. Solomon, or whoever it's going to be in the harem, says, yeah, I'll make a peace treaty with you, and you send daughters up to my palace. And if you break the treaty, guess whose head's going to be bouncing down like a bowling ball down over the wall? So in some ways, this was house arrest as well.
Okay.
Okay, so it's a complicated kind of a thing, and we don't have a whole lot of other information, but that's part of what's going on. This is treaty stuff. And when I get to chapter 3, there's 3 things I want to talk about in terms of the sins. So I'll wait with that for just a minute. But I had mentioned already that Joab seizes the horns of the altar and pleads for his life, and they say, nope, you're done, and he's put to death there. And then Benaiah becomes the general. We had Amasa, now Benaiah. Shimei is permitted to live in Jerusalem. And remember, Jerusalem is right on the border. Benjamin is to the north, and Judah to the south. Simeon has pretty much disappeared by now. And we're not going to see references to all of the different tribes. It's not like we have a history of every tribe a certain amount. Simeon, you just don't see anything about him. And some of the other ones as well. It's mainly about Ephraim and Manasseh and Benjamin and Judah, and then the Levites along the way. The others don't have a very big role that they play. But Shimei agrees to live in Jerusalem and not leave it. And then a couple of his servants run away to Gath. Maybe they knew he can't come after us, not daddy, but the boss can't come after us. So he goes after him. Solomon finds out about it and puts him to death. You left Jerusalem, you weren't supposed to, right? Right. And so, this man who cursed, even though he leads David back and acknowledges his sin, there are strictures that are put on some of these, and then it says the kingdom is established. So that's really the end of the David story. And as I've mentioned from time to time, when I would ask the students with this material, this unit, which would go really from, I don't know how far that one went. I think that might have been the whole 3rd unit was all the way from Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. But I would say, in general, I want you to tell me the David story chapter by chapter. So starting with 1 Samuel 16, you write the basic story of 16, of 17, of 18, of 19, of 20, all the way through all of 2 Samuel in the first 2 chapters here. And that's because if you're going to use this, I mean, this is our book from God. We have to find out what's in here. And I don't know if I've mentioned this story before, but I did the LWML group for, is it McLeod? Is that how they pronounce McLeod County? Is that how they,
I think so,
McLeod, is
yeah.
that the pronunciation? I did the LWML thing on Tuesday evening, and one of my ladies who came to Scripture and Life in the summers had us for dinner before that, and she, every once in a while I run into a student. So, oh yeah, we really liked you. And she says, well, some of them that I talk to, they say, oh, is he ever hard? And I said, well, the deal is, if you go to become good at something, if you go to take a physics course from Dale, and you say, I don't want to study all the physics, I just want to study what I want to study, and I don't like math.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck to you. And if you are no good at it, planes crash, okay, etc. And things blow up. But with religion, we have this idea, oh, I like people. And I just want to serve Jesus and I want to like people. We've got some tools here that we need to know pretty well. And my very first quarter at Concordia, a big tall galoot of a guy who said, oh, Dr. Trapp, can't you lighten up the load a little bit? And I think I tried, whatever that meant. But he didn't know much. He hadn't learned much. He probably got a C or a C minus or something like that. And the next quarter, he was at Central Lutheran, student teaching in my son Matt's class.
Uh-oh.
Now, you know, I put 2 and 2 together. I say, if he doesn't know it, and then he goes out to serve the church, and he doesn't know the stuff, then the people of God are going to be cheated. So you learn this stuff. You, as students here, you can do whatever you want with it. Okay? But if you're going to get a call to be a pastor or a teacher or a DCE, and you don't know this stuff, and you just say, I just want to sing nice songs and like people, and you're not helping them to know who they are in their relationship with God, then you're not qualified to do the job. So I didn't want to be mean to anybody, but I said, I was asked to teach you the Old Testament, and in 2 courses you're going to look at every chapter. You're going to look at every chapter, and you're going to manage what's here, and I want to try to give you some tools to understand how this all fits together and where it is in the story of salvation. And so with the David story I mentioned last time, I think, there is more about David's life in the Bible than about Jesus' life, by far. But let's see how it goes. Every once in a great while, there's a little theological note. The Lord was doing this, or the Lord had this in mind. You get very little hints every once in a while as the story is being told, but most of it, nothing is flat, neutral history. There is no such thing. Okay? David is being defended all the way through this material. Okay? He didn't want Saul's death. He didn't want Absalom's death. He didn't want this. He didn't want that. He tried to do this. He tried to do that. And so everybody is going to have certain ways in which they will tell a story about how does that story fit together. And this one says, David, except for the story about Uriah the Hittite being killed, that he was honorable to God. Oh, just that one murder, that was the only bad thing. No, okay, well, when we look here though, as we see this unfold, we're going to see that today is both the high point and the beginning of the low point of the rest of the story. It could have all gone very nicely, but there are problems. Now, there are 3 kinds of things. I don't know if I have them listed in here. I don't have it. The second side is pretty much the outline of 1 Kings 3 to 11. And what I have done here is I have taken my basic notes of this whole unit that I used in class and just had Maria cut and paste those in. Okay, so this is what I would have in front of me. It's a little bit more expanded than the initial notes that I did when I first put this together. But there are 3 kinds of sins: making peace treaties with other nations, worshiping other gods, and beating up on your fellow citizens. You can put almost all the rest of the stories into one of those 3 categories. And so the story is, how did they turn away? They either went after other gods or made peace treaties with other nations, and those 2 kind of fit together. Because, and that's really the first table of the law, you shall have no other gods. So what's the very first thing that Kings tells us? Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter. Well, that's not a good thing. And we might think, well, that's just, a neutral something or another. So he made a peace treaty with someone who worshipped other gods in another country and whose desire was always to take this land back. God says, this is my land. I'm giving it to you. You don't give it to anyone else. And so the very first thing that he marries Pharaoh's daughter. What's the last bunch that we're going to see? Chapter 11 is all about all of those other gods that were worshipped up on the hill, up on Mount Scopus, just on the other side of the Kidron Valley above the Mount of Olives. It's going all these other gods, and it says he was not wholly committed to God. And in the middle, we're going to find not only with foreign people, but with his own people, excluding probably the tribe of Judah, he makes people work 1 month out of 3 to build his temple and his palace. They call that corvée labor, or forced labor. And so he is going to do all of the things against the relationship. So the second table of the law, he's not going to pay people enough for what they're doing, and he's going to be a little oriental despot. Okay? He is going to be a king like all the other nations. He'll start out saying, I want wisdom from you, Lord, but he doesn't necessarily get it. I've seen a couple questions. Yes, sir?
Well, I guess you answered, I was gonna say, why is making a peace treaty a sin?
Because they worship other gods,
Okay.
and you're acknowledging they're as good as you are. Okay? Yes?
I'm a little concerned about asking this question, but you had said how when we study these, when we've been studying these books, the question is, how do the people respond to God's promises?
Mhm.
Okay, so, is it safe to say that Saul and David and Solomon were put into place so that they could, clean up the problems?
No.
No, okay.
No. The problem goes deeper with, we want a king like all the other nations. The problem is always, I look at the world around me and it's not as bad as it sounds in the church. So if we talk about everyone as a sinner in the church, and I look around and I say, I look around at my neighbors, they're not such bad people. I mean, they're not carousing and doing all sorts of terrible, wicked things. And so we come up with our own agenda for what we think is right and wrong. I don't think to clean up problems, but rather to lead the people and remind the people of God's presence.
Okay.
The very first day that we met, there was somebody who sat in the back of the room and left at the break, because I had said I do not believe that the task of the church is to fight evil. The task of the church is to proclaim the presence of God. Jesus has already defeated the evil one, but I tried to point out that evil is the word we use to talk about things against God, and I can't fight it because I'm only a human being. And I can't stop evil. I can only say this is what God has done. And so evil as an adjective, not a noun. We make it into a noun as if it exists, but that it really is simply how we describe something. So everything that God was doing, the leader, whether it was the judge or whether it was the king, was supposed to be set within the framework of this is what God is doing for us and on our behalf. So when Saul, for example, spares the life of Agag, the king of the Amalekites, or we're going to see in the reading next week about, or maybe it's 2 weeks from now, a king who is spared from up in Damascus. And so in essence, God says, when I give your enemy into your hands so he won't hurt my people anymore, don't make friends with him. But the idea was, as there are attacks that come from the outside, I will raise up somebody, a judge or a king, who will deliver you from the wickedness all around, who will deliver you so that you can live in safety and security. Instead, what they do is they welcome those people and their ideas in. So you're never really going to get rid of all of the bad stuff or clean it up. You never find Saul or David or Solomon initiating a reformation in the church, whatever that would mean. So they're not reformers in that sense. They are to be faithful to say, here's the track that God has for us, and here's how we're to respond. I might do the same thing today if I say to somebody, Jesus Christ has forgiven us for our sins. So we don't have the right to hold a sin of someone against them. You weren't nice to me in the 3rd grade. And so therefore I can be as mean to you as I want to be. And so, if we belong to the same church, and here we are 50 years later at a voters meeting, and you say, you were mean to me in the 3rd grade, and now you're not letting me say what I want to say, would you please be quiet and let me say what I want to say, and just carry that thing all the way through, well, that's something where we would say, no, wait a minute, let's go on from there. And so that's what David does with Shimei. He says, I know he did me wrong. And I understand from his position why he did that, but now let's go on from here. Well, Shimei could keep on cursing if he wants to. Or he could say, I better shut my mouth now because I'm being allowed to live, and I know that I cursed the king, and that's not a good thing to do. So it's more looking at what are the lives of the people there as we're told. And basically, how did the leaders lead in behalf of, or on behalf of God? When we look at David, we see we see Samuel who anoints him, but then we see Gad and Nathan come to talk to him. And Nathan appears just at the very end here with saying Solomon should become king. Which prophets came and spoke to Solomon in your reading today? Which prophets?
None.
None. Not a single one. Though toward the end of it, there will be somebody who will say, most of the kingdom is going to be lost to Solomon. And we will see other prophets after that, some like Elijah and Elisha, who are going to call the work of the kings to task, but very, very little in terms of what they really get to do to change the way things are going on. And so, in essence, it's a sad story, but God says, all of this, none of this had to happen. I was blessing all of you. If you live in that framework, the blessings would continue. The city of Jerusalem, city of Samaria doesn't have to be burned down, but even the leaders counseled going away from God. Very few are going to get a good mark. We've got about 20 kings in Israel and about 20 kings in Judah, and they're not going to get good marks, by and large. A couple of them are going to be reformers, really Hezekiah and Josiah, the only two who are really big reformers. There are others who will do some things along the way and be credited for them. But even what Josiah does is not going to be enough to be able to stop finally God's wrath from taking over. So when they come back, they're going to come back by grace, not because they shaped up. Okay, there's never going to be anything that if you shape up enough and if you really get good, then God will give it back to you. There will be a sense of, if you acknowledge your sin, even if you're scattered somewhere else, God is going to be looking for bringing you back at some point, and that will help you recognize that He's the one who's bringing you back. So most of it is God is in charge.
And it shows us that we need a Savior,
Yes.
but we're not talking about that right now.
We're not talking about that specifically,
is-
though every king
Yep.
would have been the savior in a limited sense
Correct.
of bringing bringing God's work and God's presence and God's blessings into their decision-making process. They didn't. And I think what it says is one after another after another. Can you find anybody who was successful, who was honorable in it? Maybe Jonathan, maybe Samuel, maybe a good bit of David, but you know, a lot of this is, look how one after another that house of cards kept falling. And it's not God's fault. That's the big thing.
God foretold it.
Well, He foretold it, and people would generally say it's God's fault that this has happened. Oh yeah,
Really?
that's the story.
Yeah.
God's at fault. Why hasn't He kept His promise? You look at the Psalms of Lament. We will get there after there'll be a couple more snows years. But when we get to the Psalms of Lament, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's just the tip of the iceberg.
But they wanted to have a king like the other
Yeah,
people had.
and some of them, they will complain to God because they say, I've been faithful. I haven't turned away from you. And yet troubles are coming to me. Solomon's not going to have that choice. David, when he's fleeing from Absalom, is not sure, is all this happening because I turned away, or because I caused Uriah's death? Okay, and I mentioned it last week. You can't really know when you've done something wrong what all the full consequences are from God. If the final full consequences come, you're lost forever because you start out broken from Him and you never fix it. And salvation says we get brought into the kingdom of grace, but then live according to it. So this says it's possible for somebody like Solomon to have turned away and to worship other gods. Okay, even though God was with him, he spoke to God twice at Gibeon, or God appeared to him twice, he still decided, I'm going to bring a little bit of the rest of my world in this too. And that's so just think of those three items, one or the other. It's going to be through the rest of Kings, it's going to be through all of the prophets. You'll hear me say this a lot, okay, because it's just how the things fit together. So it's a story about this happened, but don't go blaming God, right? Don't go blaming God for this. It's what you people have done. And yet, from people who look at Genesis 3 on, the woman you gave me, the serpent you put in the garden, and it's never changed. That's our old sinful nature that is always gonna be there. And so I never want to cater to someone's old sinful nature. I wanna say you've been changed by Christ taking his death and resurrection and putting it on you and giving you his eternal life. Now, that old way of thinking isn't the one that's primarily in charge anymore. Your life is a thank you to him for his eternal grace and mercy. That's what each of these kings heard too. But it also says, look what they did in spite of that. All right, so let's look at a little bit here. Yeah.
I was gonna ask a question about number 2 up there.
Okay.
It does say in my Bible that Solomon did worship other idols or whatever.
Other gods, yeah.
Okay, and then it says
At
that,
chapter 11,
well, I'm in chapter 3 here.
there will be a couple other things, yeah, okay.
Okay, he offered sacrifices and burned incenses at the local places of worship. Now, was that,
That's not all worshiping other gods.
okay,
Not
because
yet.
then it goes on to say he offered 1,000 burnt offerings at
Yeah.
Gibron, but that's
Given,
good?
yeah. That's okay there,
Okay.
yeah. Though later, the problem is, see, we don't have the temple built here yet. Once the temple gets built, there's also gonna be another subtext that's gonna say, every other worship place was a bad one. And worship should have been only in Jerusalem. And so that's going to be a later theme all the way through. We're gonna hear the next, or see the next 3 weeks. But just this part is not bad there yet.
Okay.
Okay, here then, Solomon says he loves the Lord, and that he goes to Gibeon. Remember Gibeon? I talked about this last week, that's the sun standing still town where Joshua made that treaty with the people who said they had come from far away. And it's one of the Hivite cities. There are 4 Hivite cities. Kiriath Jearim, where the ark was for a good long while, is another one of those. And so God says, make them hewers of wood and drawers of water. Remember, this is the one where Saul killed some of them, and the 2 children of Rizpah and the 5 of Merab were put to death because of what Saul had done. Well, Gibeon in Chronicles is identified. And Chronicles is going to be written in its final form in the exile, according to what most of the scholars say. It's going to say that this is where the tabernacle was. We don't have it referred to virtually at all, even here, but apparently that was the worship place. It's just a little bit north and west of Jerusalem, memory serves me right. El Jib is what it's called today. And so Solomon goes there, and 2 different times God will appear to him there. All right, and so the first time he appears to him, and he says, well, I want to be wise. Most kings want to be rich. God says, okay, you want to be wise, I'll make you wise, I'll make you rich too. And, I mean, you can't count all the gold in the next chapters. I mean, this is rich man here. This is, big stuff. And so God says, well, I will give you that other blessing as well. And then we have the case of the 2 prostitutes. Well, that's wise. Was Solomon going to chop that baby in 2?
No.
You don't know?
I think we do know. I think in this one we do know.
Okay.
Was he going to chop that baby in 2?
No.
No. What he does is he applies a litmus test that he knows will bring out who the real mother is. Okay, so his wisdom is he knows how to get at the truth. I'm always interested in our system of justice in our country. The judge usually just sits back and talks about whether it's okay to admit evidence or something like that. In Great Britain, the judge gets involved in doing interrogation as well, if he doesn't think the lawyers are doing a good job, at least from the things I've seen. And so here, he's the judge. Okay, he's going to determine what's going to happen. And the whole thing about the office of the keys, whoever you admit or whoever you don't admit. If you admit somebody, then the king can act in their favor or listen to their case. If you don't admit them, then they're out on their own. Here, these 2 women come before King Solomon. You'd think they'd come before somebody else, but he knows what will bring out the truth of the matter. He knows how to get at the truth, and that's part of his wisdom. There'll be much more that'll be around than that. So, has lots of officials. when you look at Saul, he has Doeg the Edomite who runs his sheep herding operation. Okay, and Jonathan is taking care of some of the land and some of the animals. Now, he has 12 officials, and what he does is he redivides the country so that it crosses tribal borders. If you want to exile somebody, when you take them into exile, what you do is you mix them with other populations so that somebody might squeal on you if you say, I don't like what's going on, let's try and run away from here. So he mixes people so they're not all of the same. So it's like, you know, if you want to make trouble, then you mix some people from Iowa and North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana and Minnesota and Wisconsin together. And if one of them from Wisconsin says, I think we ought to revolt, somebody from Montana might say, I'm going to rat them out, and maybe I'll get a little bit extra supper tonight. And so he divides them up, and 1 month out of 12, you have to pay for all of what the king needs for his daily meals. That's exactly what Samuel said was going to happen. Samuel says, you want a king who's going to serve you, you're going to be serving your king. Bingo, here it is. All right? We know what's going to happen when this takes place. But then it says, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand of the seashore. That ring any bells? Abraham, exactly. And so all of a sudden here in 1 Kings, the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 13 and 15 and 17, all of a sudden now, you know, with David, they took the land now. They're as happy as a lark. Many as the sand on the seashore, we could also say, or as the stars in the heavens. And so it says Solomon's ruling over all that land. And then says that he not only is wise, but he writes a lot of proverbs and songs. He may not have written everything that people think he wrote. We may not have anything or how much that they think he wrote, but it sounds like he is I think they call him a bibliophile. Not that he would have had all the books, but somebody, or no, polymath. Polymath is the word. Somebody who knows a lot about everything. And they say that in our day and age, nobody could really be a polymath anymore, but in the 1700s, there were people who could still kind of control most of the knowledge, a few of them. I may be wrong on the dates on that, but the concept is that back here, Solomon would have known everything about everything. And so then people from all over come to hear him. Then he decides and makes the plans to build a temple. We'll take a break and then we'll talk about the temple. As we continue now, we'll look in the next chapters at the specifics of the building of the temple. Between the building of the temple and the building of the palace, it's going to take 20 years. And particularly with the temple, the idea is that there would not be any noise at the site. That this would be built quietly, so there was no dressing of stones there, no cutting of wood there. Everything had to be made before they brought it there. At least that's how it is all decided. Hiram of Tyre had already been working with David and now with Solomon. And so when Hiram of Tyre, where is Tyre? What country is that today?
Iraq, isn't it?
No,
Iran?
Lebanon.
Oh, Lebanon.
Right along the Mediterranean. So what they're going to do is they're going to cut the lumber or cut the trees, bring them down to the Mediterranean, float them down in the water, and then bring them up probably at a place like Akko or someplace like that, or someplace where they are close to be able to bring it up into the temple area. By this point, they already have, it's the Iron Age, so they would have figured out how you're going to be able to cut wood and things like that. They're not going to have power saws or things, but they are going to be able to do that work. And so the cedars of Lebanon are well known. The cedar wood is well known, and so Hiram says he will trade the cedars of Lebanon for wheat and for oil.
What is Hiram?
He's a name. He's a guy.
Is he a king or?
He's a king, probably a priest king,
Oh.
which they had in those days as well. And so Tyre and Sidon are the two major cities. Tyre actually has part of it, it's both an island city and a city that's on dry land. And so Tyre is the place from which they will have a lot of ships going out. And Carthage in the area that's now Tunisia, that would have been one of their daughter places, and they did a lot of maritime trade throughout the ancient world. And there's a beautiful little cove in the northeastern part of the island of Tyre where the ships could be put in safety. I mean, they're not ships like what we talk about today, but the vessels would have been able to be put in safety during storms. And so, you know, you've got a whole 3/4 of an island that's protecting it. I think it's at the time of Alexander the Great. The Assyrians had tried to attack and take the city of Tyre and get that port, but it's pretty hard to besiege an island and to keep people from going in and out. So in essence, it was more complicated than this, but Alexander said to his forces, start throwing rocks in the water till we get there. It's about a 1/2 mile moat that they built, so now it's a peninsula instead of an island, but and then they took the city. That it is still today, this real nice little cove, northeastern part of the city or the island, but there's also part on the dry land. And so Solomon uses this conscripted labor where he is gonna have 1/3 of them working every month, and then 2 months they go do their own things, and so it's going to be a burden on everybody when the heads of the family are gone. We have no more details about exactly how all of that works out, but the laborers and the stone cutters, and the laborers are gonna be the hewers of wood, the ones who are going to bring that. And so the technical date is 480 years after they left Egypt. They start work on this, and so the temple is 60 by 20 by 30 cubits. Now a cubit is about 18 inches. So it's about 90 feet by 30 feet by 45 feet high. I would guess that the building we are in is larger than that. All right, so, but if you have only mud brick houses all around, a major building is gonna be a major building. And so they will often talk about buildings as just a public building if the floor plan for it is anything more than just a very small place for people to live. So, and the 20 by 20 by 20 where the Holy of Holies would be, that's double in dimension. And Jim, I was thinking, I needed to ask you about this. So what is the volume difference if you go from 10 cubits, like 15 feet by 15 feet by 15 feet, 30 by 30 by 30, in terms of feet? Would that be 4 times as much? Is there an easy way to figure that out?
Well, 30 times 30 times 30 would be
81,000?
30 by 30 by 30.
It'd be 27,000, okay?
And 15 times 15 is 225
Okay.
times 15.
225, that'd be 22,000, or 2,250,
Yeah.
3,375.
Yeah, it would be close to 8 or 9 times, wouldn't
Okay, so 8 or 9 times as much
it? Yeah.
in terms of the volume, okay. All
I'll
right,
figure it out.
all right. But anyway, the dimensions here are roughly twice the size of the tabernacle. Okay, that we saw earlier on, particularly for the Holy of Holies. And the way it sounds is, there are some buildings that we have around town like this, where you've got a certain base, and it's a little bit wider on the next level, and a little bit wider on the next level. And I'm not sure, reading this is kind of like reading the material on the tabernacle. It really is like going back to Menards. And the trouble is, a lot of the words, it's just kind of hard to know exactly what those words mean, because we don't have the building. You know, if you could go to the building and say, okay, here's the mortise, and here's the tenon, or here's this, and here's that. But anyway, it sounds like the top is a little bit wider than the bottom, and they would have supports on the outside then. So you don't have one big structure that's weighing right down on top of itself in that way. And so almost like you build a ship where it's wider at the top of the ship than it is at the bottom. And so, then there is this request to God, walk by me, or the Lord says to him, walk with me and I will bless you. Now that is not a promise if he does it. All right, that says, you keep on going this track, you'll keep on having the blessings. So it's not a future if you do it, but I've already been taking care of this. You stay within that framework, things will continue to go well for you. You leave that framework, and then things are going to be a problem, which is what we get all the way through the Bible. But our old sinful nature always thinks, I do something, then I get something. That's the way our old sinful nature thinks, and we have to realize that's how we read the Bible, and how even biblical scholars who have looked at it for years, they read it in terms of rewards if you're good. Okay, rewards if you're good, instead of you're already there. And so we as Lutheran Christians will say, we are baptized into Christ, we are already marked for eternity and living out eternity. So now be what you are instead of be what I tell you to, and then I maybe make you something better. So I never have to try to get good so that God will bless me. I'm already at peace with him through Christ. And that's so hard that even if we hear it every day, we still do our thinking in such a way to go a different direction. Okay? God says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to take care of you. Not if you're a good person, but I'm already doing that. You veer off the path, and then you lose what's there. Okay? Yes, sir.
It was 8 times,
8 times.
and I think there's a simple way to do it. You doubled everything,
Okay?
2 times 2 times 2 is 8.
Works for me.
Works
Thank
for
you.
me too.
Thank you. So 8 times the size of the other one, just by doubling. Del, did you have that in your head?
Close, but not quite.
Close, but not quite, okay. I figured some of you guys who do math ought to help me out with that one, so thank you. Yep.
Close enough, huh?
Well, that's exact then, yes.
Just 8 times the time.
Picture that someone made
There are all sorts of pictures that people have made.
of this new temple.
Yeah.
I would think that the designs in it were most beautiful.
There are so many disagreements about what it looked like, because even though it would look like you have everything nailed down, a lot of the pieces are missing. In other words, a lot of the things about this are missing.
Oh, like what?
Okay, I can't tell you off the top of my head. But when somebody who's an architect sits down, there's a fellow named Lean Rittmeyer who has done a lot of these, and I just have never sent away for the thing, but go online and Google images sometime, and just Google images Solomon's Temple. You will see how many different viewpoints they have on how it really looked. Okay, but that would be the easiest. I'm sorry, but because I'm taping this and putting it on YouTube, if I take anybody else's picture and it goes out onto YouTube, I am exposing myself to a lawsuit of using something illegally. So I can't put anything other than what I have here up on there. And I probably could bring a picture book and show it. There's all sorts of them that are around, but even after all of that, they will say, well, I don't know if you understood this correctly, or, you know, this word here, what does it really mean? And so it looks nice and neat when you read it in the Bible, but in every one of those, there are questions about exactly what that term meant. It's fun to go back into the early Bronze Age, 3000 before Christ, and they have found at Sumer in southern Iraq, they find some cookbooks. Cookbooks. And then the question is now, what are they really talking about? You know, what herbs, what spices, what amounts and everything, and then everybody is all over the map of what they really think. You know, so they'll go around and they'll say, okay, what plant remains do we have in archaeological digs? And so they probably were talking about this one. So, I mean, the kind of issues behind it are always, you know, a lot more complex than what we would think. It's way above my pay grade to understand how to figure this stuff out. And so just reading it and looking up in the dictionary what they say it means is only the beginning of what somebody thinks. But the reality is going to be more complicated than that.
But
Okay.
like all the beautiful pomegranates and
Yep.
designs that they
Now-
had inlaid with gold.
The thing that you want to remember with that is they don't, in other cultures, they would have depictions of their gods. So this, you shall have no other gods, you shall not make any graven images, all the pomegranates and all the flowers and everything, that's a little thing that says they were following that command of God, not to make pictures, because in other cultures, they would have all sorts of stone figures and poured figures in various metals and wooden figures that they would have chiseled and carved. And so this one says it was all that. I'll come back to the gold in just a minute, but I need to talk about the gold more as well. Chapter 7 then. We get the description about the house of the forest of Lebanon being built, and that's 100 by 50 by 30 cubits, with two parts, the hall of pillars and the hall of the throne. And so you're going to have family living quarters, and you're going to have meeting quarters. Okay, so the king stays in his palace. He goes to work, in the White House, I think the east wing is the living quarters of the family, right? And then the west wing is where all the offices for all of the other authorities are. And so I think that the Oval Office is right in the middle there, facing to the south. I've never gotten inside, so anybody, it looks like the Oval Office would be right in the middle toward the south side of it. But anyway, so you've got in every place, if they're going to live there, that they're going to have some private living quarters. And so then it talks about another fellow named Hiram, who leads in the development and the work of this. And his mother is an Israelite, his father is from Tyre. So another fellow named Tyre. And we've talked minimally about the various lodges and the Masonic order and that. The Masonic orders go back to Hiram. And they say he is the one who knew how a perfect building was to be built. And then that's used to say, here's how you become a better person. So instead of God coming down and saving us from our sins, you become better if you learn the right and proper way to live life. And so the problem that I as a Christian would have is everything the scriptures say you can never get there. And people who live under the law never really get there, because you can never be perfect. But the idea here is, here's how you improve in various things about the way you live your life. And so, very opposite kind of approach. It doesn't say that in the Bible here, but that's where the various orders from a lot of the lodges, that's where they go back to and say that they have their ideas from that. So in addition to the people who do the building, you have the people who are the architects who are involved. And so, and the ones who do fine work, and that's where this other Hiram comes in as well. But the idea was that Hiram, king of Tyre, had a perfect building. And that what he gives a Lebanese pattern to the temple. Okay, it would be the same pattern that we find with the tabernacle, but that is kind of like the official thing with a holy place and a holy of holies and all of that. And then the temple vessels, that they are of burnished bronze. Why wouldn't they all be of gold? Heavy on one hand, I think they'd also melt. Okay, so if you have something that's pure gold, you're gonna be melting that along the way. But then things that they wouldn't necessarily have melting, like gold for the tables and lamps and things like that. I've talked with you about this before, Dale, but I remember something like the total amount of gold on the earth could fit in a cube like 45 by 45 by 45 feet.
I don't know that.
It's a rather limited thing. You would, it's hard to believe with all the different gold that would be in various places, but it's a rather limited amount of space. Silver, much more common, but it is really just a very rare element, and I don't know if I have the numbers right on that, but a lot of the gold that we have might have been in one of Cleopatra's crowns for all we know. A lot of the stuff that gets reused and, you know, taken by somebody else. And so you'll get more out of the ground, but it is a limited amount. It's not like you would have piles and piles like you might see coal or something like that. And I'll try to look up again sometime. I've looked it up a couple times and then just don't quite remember the exact dimensions, but yeah.
Well, I just wanna go back, well, you got all these specific sizes and dimension and stuff. It has to be really important. What does that state about order, being orderly and
Yeah, there you get into guest land in
Yeah,
terms
well,
of
that's-
what's all being said
Right,
by it, but this is the place, remember, where the angel stopped bringing the plague in 2 Samuel 24. This is the place that Judaism would say is where Isaac was almost put to death. On the rock that's under the dome now, that would have been where the Holy of Holies was.
yeah.
Judaism, not in the Bible, would also say this is the very place where God formed Adam and Eve and then put them in a garden in the east. It is the place from which Islam says Muhammad was taken up into the heavens to be given visions. You don't like, it's not like you can get another one, you know, go buy another one across the road or something like that. And so, as I've talked about, a temple is the umbilical cord between heaven and earth. So God is actually going to be present in that Holy of Holies. We're going to see that in Isaiah, when Isaiah sees into the Holy of Holies, and he sees the cherubim surrounding God and all the beings crying out, holy, 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 and all of that. So this is the point of access. Now the northern tribes would have said, we have that at Bethel, where Jacob dreamt about that stairway going up and down. And so when we see the northern tribes pick Bethel, there is more ancient justification for that one, they would say. And one of the problems we're going to have in the south, the Leah tribes, Reuben across the Jordan, Simeon and Judah down in the south, and Levi as a worshiping or a leading tribe for worship and legal stuff, they're going to be in Jerusalem. The other tribes are going to say, no, we should be up in the north. And that's where we should be worshiping God. So there's a question about, by many people, about whether there's not such a tension here, and that all this aggrandizement, they're saying, this really wasn't where God should be approached anyway. So it's just one of those things that they detect when they read the Bible. Biblical scholars, when they read the Bible, they will say, there is a tension that's going on here. But let me talk about the gold for just a second. Where were the banks in that day?
The temple.
The temple is the bank. The temple is the bank. Solomon is so rich that they have flat sheets of gold that they nail up on all the walls and put over all the structures they can put it over. And then they've got so much gold, they've got another 200 shields that they make, that they pour the gold over, that they have in the next building over. But you can only put so much on the walls. It can only hold so much, and then it just falls down. So, and that's going to be in your fortress. That's going to be in your stronghold. That's really what it is. It's your bank vault. And because they would say, our God has given us the blessing to be able to have all of this, they have it in the temple to celebrate. Okay. There is a possibility that some of that is on my hand right now. Or on your hand. We have no idea to know how. But 5 years after Solomon dies, King Shishak, or Pharaoh Shishak, is going to come and take all the gold down to Egypt. Take it all away, and then they replace it with bronze shields. So you turn away from God, and all the goodies that you had, you lose. Right, and so that's part of the way the game is going here. But that is the bank vault. Kathy and I got to see a lot of the gold of the world. Back in the, probably in the late 70s, maybe early 80s. We went to New York, and at the south end of Manhattan, you could go down into the Federal Reserve. And have any of you ever done that? It was 5 levels down into the bedrock. They did a movie about it some years ago where they had somebody tunneling in from somewhere. And with these trucks and everything, they had trucks going all different directions, and where was the gold actually. But what this was is it's where a lot of the world trade went on. So the American amount, there were 2 things. They had just, I think, cyclone fence. Okay, cyclone fence, and maybe a gate that swings this wide open, and piled high 2 stacks of pallets, and I'm sure the pallet was more than just wood, you know,
Yeah.
after a certain point. But there were 2 of them stacked pretty high. And that was a good bit of the wealth of the United States used for trade. So if there was between countries, there was a transfer of goods, the boys in the band would go and take 4 bricks of gold from here and put it in there. More complicated than that, but some of the major countries of the world, they had very open, you could go down there because it's behind a fence. And so they're constantly doing trading back and forth right in that room. Yeah, Dale?
Your numbers are, in a given year, you can, the world produces about enough gold to fill an average living room size volume.
Okay,
The total amount of gold ever is estimated to be about 1/3 the volume of the Washington Monument.
1/3 of the Washington Monument, okay. Ever.
What's in Fort Knox then?
The rest of our gold,
Okay.
but nobody knows how much.
IOUs,
Huh?
IOUs.
It's probably empty, right? Moss. Just a few moss flying around, yes.
At that time, did they, when they traded with the countries around, they didn't pay with gold at that time, did they?
They would have had to, yes.
Well, wheat, with Hiram, it was an exchange.
With Hiram, it was an
Goods.
exchange,
Yeah.
so it wouldn't all be gold.
Kind of bargain.
Yeah, it's a bartering. But they also would have used this, I mean, he's gathering that from other people. He's saying what you want, and so in his trading of horses that can be used for chariots and things like that, he gets them from Egypt and from Cilicia. Cilicia is up in Turkey, Egypt of course is down, but then there are others who are buying those horses, and so he probably says, okay, I want your gold for that. But if you don't have it protected very well, I mean, that's why they were willing to allow us to look at it. Because it's 5th basement down into bedrock. Nobody is gonna be able to get in there from the side. You know, there's gonna be seismographs and everything, so nobody's gonna be able to get in there, so it's relatively safe. You aren't gonna be able to take a bar up the elevator with you. And so, you know, if it's well enough protected that nobody can get to it, then that's the way that they would do it. And I don't know, it was during Nixon's era, I think, that we went off the gold standard, wasn't it? 1962 or something like that?
Nixon, yeah.
That wouldn't be
That would be Nixon 62.
Kennedy.
No,
that'd be
Kennedy.
Kennedy.
Was it Kennedy?
Yeah, 62.
He was 66.
Yeah,
Kennedy became president in
I'm
'68.
thinking it was during Nixon's era, so it would be in the 70s then maybe.
early 70s.
Early 70s or late 60s. But anyway, you know, the idea of having this is bragging rights, and you know, how does he become this absolutely wealthy? David wasn't that wealthy. Well, it's because God was blessing him. And the gold is part of the blessing, okay, that comes along the way. Well, anyway, chapter 8. I mentioned very early on in this unit, in these 10 weeks of course, that one of the big themes is the ark. And so the temple is built as a house for the ark. That is what unites all the tribes, because the ark contains the 10 words, the 2 tablets of stone with the words that God had given at Mount Sinai. And so part of this is a political decision as well. Everybody can rally around the ark, even if they don't rally around David or Solomon or anybody else. And so the ark is brought up to the temple, and innumerable sacrifices are offered. It's placed under the wings of the cherubim. These are not angels. Cherubim are much more wild kind of animals with wings on them. Okay, so what we would call mythical creatures actually is the way that they're described. An angel doesn't have wings in the Bible. I know people get kind of disappointed with that. But angels, every time they're around, they look like people. So what does it say about the young man or the young men in the tomb for Jesus? They had white shimmering clothing on. It doesn't say that they were flying around or anything like that. And what happens is in Isaiah 6, he sees a vision of these cherubim and other creatures around the place where God's footstool is in there, and he is filled with fear, and one of them flies and takes the tongs and touches his mouth with a hot coal, and his guilt is taken away. But those aren't messengers. Malachim are all human beings, or someone who looks like a human being on earth bringing a message. So sometimes you have a prophet who brings a message, sometimes a messenger of God. We saw these with the one who comes to Samson's mother, and a couple of the other places, the one who meets Joshua and says, Joshua says, are you on our side or the other side? He says, I'm the head of the armies of the living God. He's not described as having floppy wings in the back. Okay? We'll talk about it a little bit more, but I probably won't resolve it for y'all. Because there are certain things we like. And if you want to know angels with wings and cherubs, that's Rome. That's the Roman Empire. That's where that really starts showing up. And then it gets brought in, and never do you have these little baby cherubs in the Bible anywhere.
So is seraphim, is cherubim and seraphim, are
Yeah, that's
Seraphim
in
is the
part of
same
the
thing?
communion service.
kind of,
Well, they are all strange creatures to us. Okay? What the ISIS was destroying in Iraq is some of the depictions of a lion with wings. And some are depictions of serpents with wings. I translated a book, an archaeological book for Otmar Kiel and Christoph Eulinger for Fortress Press called God's Goddesses and the Images of God in the Old Testament Era. In there, what they did was they found all sorts of representations on stamp seals. So if you have a ring and then you put your ring into clay or into wax or something like that to show that it has been sealed, and the person who opens it knows that it hasn't been opened, kind of like what we do with trucks when they seal a load with just that little wire and then a seal, and if that seal has been broken, they know somebody at least had the chance to tamper with it. Well, they have snakes with 4 wings that they have found in ancient stamp seals. So that's Kiel particularly has spent his life examining those and trying to look for, when we think of something and we read it, what were they thinking of? What did it really look like? And so from about, how far back did he go? I think maybe 12 or 1300 BC to about 500 BC. He and Eulinger wrote this book, and it was for another particular issue that they were dealing with, about a 500-page book with all sorts of illustrations. And so you can see Baal, kind of like a long, real tall, skinny guy with a firebolt in his hand, because Baal is seen as the storm god, and other depictions of them and other deities and all. But that's as close as we get. There is none with 6 wings, but they had a lot of them with 4 wings that they found in these various sites. The trouble with a lot of them that they have found is that people often go and dig illegally, and then they sell what they can find. And so they're not always from what they would call a site that was could be approved, but they know that these, were ancient, they just don't know always where they came from. But the cherubim, we hear that word cherub angels, and we think of these pretty little smiley babies. The word saraf is the word to burn. To burn. Let's say, so the cherubim are more with the wings spread. The seraphim are much more like we might call a fire-breathing dragon. All right. We move on. I'm not gonna resolve any more to game than that for you right now. There are some things that's okay, keep it on the back burner till you get to heaven, and then it won't matter.
Heaven
So,
sounds like an awful scary place.
pardon?
Heaven sounds like an awful scary place.
Yeah.
Flying snakes down through my living room, I don't know. Dragons.
Well, take your pick.
And we do have a choice, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah, the other side has its own kind of scary demons, you know what that. Oh my, I lost them all. Lost them all for all eternity. The glory of the Lord comes down upon the temple then. Like the cloud that was by the tabernacle. The presence of God is there. And so the king, yes,
When we get more to Isaiah, no, not Isaiah, Ezekiel and that time, I imagine you're gonna be talking about the ark at that time or what?
ask me next April.
Right, because I'm thinking, all these things that were really prescribed by God when the tabernacle was set up. The tabernacle was never a fixed temple. It was a place, that was the holy place.
Where they moved until they didn't have to move anymore.
Yeah.
Right, and the ark was central on that meeting place. But now it's a temple, and it's a fixed place, and God, like with the kings, God wasn't really so keen on having a fixed place, because
He is by now. In Samuel that we've looked at the last few weeks, he says to David, don't build that, but now he says this is okay. Because
Well,
now
it's okay,
you're
but it
settled
never
in.
was really, I guess, he preferred, I'm thinking he preferred the concept of being with the people.
Yes, but now he says, in fact, in Deuteronomy, it says, the place where I will cause my name to dwell, where I will cause my dweller to dwell. So there's nothing wrong with this now. Okay? So, while he's moving them up into
It's not
the.
God just going along,
No,
okay.
no, not this one. So anyway, the king then blesses everybody who's gathered together and then prays to the Lord, including this thing that says, if we sin, then would you please forgive us? Remove all the problems that come on. And we get this little hint. We don't have it today. At least I would not try to make a point of it. But if you have rain in one place and not another, or if you have someone doing a raid, or if you have someone who is stealing some people and selling them to slavery or things like that, any of that happens only because you've turned away from God. And Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 27 and 28 both talk about this in more detail. We'll see some of the evidence of it in the book of Amos, where he talks about it in those terms. But here it says, when we acknowledge our sin, please undo the consequences of that. The problem is most of them will not undo or will not acknowledge their sin. So in chapter 9 is the second time that Solomon is going to be in a communication with God. And here he says, my name is here forever. The place where he causes his name to dwell. You know where that is in the New Testament? Go make disciples of all nations and baptize them in the name or into the power of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Every one of us is a temple of God. Every one of us is the place where God dwells. That's the New Testament version of this one. So
But
don't
that's
put
only
yourself.
through baptism, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, but, we're all anointed into that relationship, so wherever we go, there God goes.
Yeah.
Which is what Adam and Eve were in the beginning. The temple is an intermediate arrangement when God says, I've got to hide behind the curtain, otherwise I'll destroy you with my holiness. Once Jesus dies and rises, he says, well, I don't need that anymore. Because now I can come with the forgiveness of Christ and come upon you and I will not destroy you. So anyway, in addition, I've got 2 minutes, so now I can't stop anymore. Sorry. So Hiram then says, please pay me, and then he looks at what he got to get some cities. He says, it's a bunch of junky cities you gave me. We don't know much more about it than that, but he's not real happy. So Solomon is playing his game. He's going to do whatever he wants, and you better just be happy with what you get. Sort of like why they started unions. So Solomon, he builds not only Jerusalem, but 3 major cities, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, all with the same pattern of the city gate. And Yigael Yadin, he went back to dig in, I think it was Megiddo, after he had done Hatzor, and he goes to do the dig. And I even have, they had some old movies on this back when I first came to Concordia, and he says, now you dig right here and you're gonna find a post. You dig right here and you're gonna find another post. Because as you walk into the city gate, there'd be 3 rooms on each side. And he had found them at Hatzor, and he knew, because he saw a little bit of what was dug in Megiddo, and so he says to the workers, dig here and you'll find this. Well, it was a McDonald's pattern. Did the same thing with all 3 of them, and you did most of your transactions right in the city gate. Inside, you've just got narrow streets and houses, but in the city gate, that's where you would gather together. And so he is involved in getting foreigners also as forced labor, and involved in particularly horse trading, that he was developing horses and all of that. Chapter 10, then we have the Queen of Sheba who comes from where? From Sheba.
Yeah.
He's buried in Grant's tomb.
Is it? Buried in Grant's tomb, yeah. The trouble is, you say Ethiopia, and many people say yes. And we have a member here, Demalash Yosef Umer, who can always tell me the city where they believe that Solomon is buried. Or I'm sorry, not where Solomon's, but where the ark is buried, where the ark is held. In northeastern Africa. So some people say she came from there, and that she got impregnated by him, and that the king in Ethiopia used to be known as the Lion of Judah. So there is a tradition that generation after generation, all the way to Haile Selassie, that they were all descendants of Solomon. Well, you're not going to prove that one way or another. And nobody goes in that building either. They say, oh no, that's too sacred, we can't go in there. We know they're wrong because the ark is in Washington, D.C., in a storage facility. I've seen that. So I know that the other idea is wrong, but
So that's true.
yes. Don't you believe everything you see?
I do now.
So anyway, he's involved in all sorts of trade, and the winds blow half year in one direction, half year in the other direction. So if you went down to Eilat at the southern point of the eastern end of the Red Sea by the Gulf of Aqaba, then you could go from there and you can go all the way to India. And apparently that's what they were doing, and then bringing goods back as well. And so he has his own chariot corps and everything. So some of the archaeologists' problems is they read what's in the Bible and they go try to match it up. And it doesn't always match up. It doesn't always match the right generation. And so they've, in earlier decades of the 20th century, they thought they knew where Solomon's stables were. Then they say, well, no, that's the wrong level, and probably those were maybe just storerooms or something like that. And so there are a lot of archaeologists who say, don't dare use anything in the Bible, that's going to lead you astray. And so if all I'm doing is carrying my Bible in one hand and my trowel in the other hand, they say you're going to get messed up all the time. I don't need the archaeologists to prove anything in the Bible to me. You're not going to prove the faith, no matter if you prove what's going on here. Some people actually think some of the eastern wall of Jerusalem goes all the way back to the time of Solomon. But there's no way to prove it. Okay, they wouldn't have had coins at that point. If you have coins being made, You might find a coin somewhere that you would know when that coin was minted, and then the blocks had been put on top of that. When we redid our house, redid our bathroom, under the linoleum was a 1920 penny. And so I'm assuming that they built that bathroom in there in 1920, or they re-floored it in 1920 or something like that. Okay, because you know if it's a 1920 penny, they didn't do that in 1913. Right, and so archaeological work, a lot of pottery, some coins later on, but if you don't have something underneath it, and they're not gonna dig that wall up, then you can't know for sure. But then chapter 11, the bad chapter. Now he turns away, he loves many foreign women. The Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites are all from around the area. This is nobody from way, way far away. This is just all the countries round about. So here, for example, are the Edomites, here are the Moabites, here are the Ammonites. What's the fourth one there? Sidon, Tyre and Sidon are up here, and then the Hittites basically would have been the remnant from all of that area. And it says that you're not supposed to make treaties. Well, he makes them anyway. And he does human thinking instead of God's thinking. He's not using what God has said. And so it says he has 700 princesses and 300 concubines. A concubine is simply a woman who doesn't have a full share in the inheritance. Does it look like a round number to you?
Yeah.
So he goes off after other gods, like Chemosh and Molech, and big studies about those guys. And so then it says God is going to tear the kingdom away from him. And you have three different places where it's torn away. The Edomites revolt to the south and east. Damascus up in Syria under Rezin revolts. And the northern kingdom, as we're going to see next week, Jeroboam takes over, and Rehoboam is not able to hold the northern kingdom. So right after this point is when we're going to have the split between the northern kingdom, which is everything roughly all of this, and then some across the Jordan, and the southern kingdom right down here. And in some cases with the Philistines over here to the west, it's not going to be a very big state at all. And God says, I'll leave one tribe only because I made a promise to David that one of his descendants would always rule.